Well, let's start with the last session with the keynote of Raquel Gatto from ISOC. So please, Raquel, when you want to start, you can. Thank you, Luca. Eder, could you display my presentation, please? Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk about PEP because in the morning I had this. I'm gonna talk standing because it's less risk. In the morning I dropped the class, so I'm going to speak in Portuguese. And if you have any difficulty, we have the translation, and also we can speak later. I'm going to explain the topic of this panel, which is future of the internet future scenarios, and I'm going to propose this participatory dynamic as we have had before. So I'm going to show you this project. It's a project that is being developed by ISOC since last year that is to capture the ideas and identify the the vectors and possible futures for the internet in the next decade. Then I'd like to start a debate. We can have three big groups here, and we can go back with our conclusions. But I'm not going to spoil what is new. Before speaking about the future, we have mentioned the former participants of this school, and I had promised to bring the photo, and I brought it. This photo was taken in the first SSIG 8 years ago. I'm here on this corner, and many well-known faces on this picture. And why am I speaking about the past right now? Because we were the youth at that time. So this is our future then, and we will be the elder in the future. So I want to give you this perspective. When we think about 5 years ago, what were the technologies? What changed in internet that you had no idea that could happen? What were the disruptive forces that were able to change the use of the internet in the last 5 years, or changed the trends of the internet for the future, for good and for bad? So when we think about that, it's easier to do this futurologist exercise. And why do this kind of exercise? Because internet is not guaranteed. This is a built system. It has a basis on parameters, not only technical, an open internet, resilient internet, and also political parameters. We have seen all these multi-stakeholder models. They are constructions that make the internet as it is today. So we have to start thinking on questions like, is this the internet that we want? What is the internet that we want? And what are the forces that are leading us towards this way? And this one, it's like we have some examples of someone who have tried to look into the future. So when the phone started, many people said that this telephone is very complicated. I'm sure it won't become a means of communication. And one decade later, what happened next? And also the classical example of the Titanic ship, they were sure that this could never sink. They had top technologies, they had been working on that for years, and it sank. And we can have many other examples like nuclear power and the personal computer. People said it made no sense to want this personal computer at home. So and see what we have today. We have at home. We have on our wrists. We have in our cars, in your hands. So when we think about this, leaders from the past and thinkers from the past were not able to believe in this technology, and they really happened. So we have the black swans, that those events that are totally unavoidable, and there's certain and events that we knew for sure that would happen, and we didn't care about them. So how did we structure that? Well, we tried to draft something that could identify the future. So this first phase happened last year. We have spoken to many experts around the world. We had 150 individual interviews, and we had also this online questionnaire, and we had 1,500 answers for this questionnaire. We were with almost 2,000 contributions, especially from these questions: what would be the future internet? What would the scenario be like? What would get us closer to this scenario or away from this? And we were able to identify 9 vectors or drivers. I didn't know how to translate this word drivers. I tried to look look up with Spanish dictionaries, and we could use also variables, indicators. We are going to talk about later because I couldn't find the exact word. But this is the idea, to understand what are the disruptive forces that are able to change the future of the internet. So this year we have started this second phase, that is the phase of detailing all of these forces and what would be the concrete cases that we are able to foresee. So that's where we are right now. Again, we are receiving online contributions. The exercise that we are going to do today in order to think about the scenarios, especially about the drivers, the future drivers. And then we will have this final report where we are going to draw all these scenarios with a lot of colors and history, and celebrating not only the the anniversary of Isaac, as Raul said. It's difficult to have this organization that is now 25 years old and is stronger and stronger and bigger with members and participation. So we have to celebrate this anniversary, and also we have to think and plan the next 25 years. And this report, we intend to launch it on September, release it on September, and we will use the IGF to disclose it. So we are going to think about the future, and we are going to guarantee with concrete recommendations how to preserve the core of the internet. What are the clauses that we have to preserve in order to guarantee the evolution of the future? So I was thinking about that, and I wanted to explain these disruptive forces. You can have 2 trends. Trends is something that you're sure that is going to happen, and you have some things that are not so certain. something is going to happen in that field, but you don't know to each side it is going to go. So these are the 9 drivers that we were able to identify. Many of them were mentioned here, like artificial intelligence and machine learning, and also the convergence of the physical world and internet, the future of the market and the competition, the increase of participation of governments, the impact of cybercrimes, also the evolution of the internet itself and its standards. And in the center, we have identified the areas of impact. More than drivers, they are areas that have a larger uh, reach. The future of the rights, uh, the challenges and the gaps, and the challenges for culture and media. And I want to focus on the exercise. We're going to talk about the legal issue. So let's try to gather in groups and try to debate what I have selected from these 9 drivers. And the one I selected was digital exclusion, this topic. Uh, this is very dear for this region. It's very important for this region. The translation is not exact and precise, but what do we mean? It's not only we're not only speaking about connectivity and access, but also the access as a participant, to be excluded as a participant. What could drive us to participate more? And even if everyone was connected, would everyone participate on the same way? Have you thought about that? Maybe sometimes we focus a lot on infrastructure and capillarity, but maybe could we really achieve this future in which we will be all connected? And if we weren't, what would it mean? And besides that, we have this other topic to provoke you. When we are speaking about digital security and connectivity, we have also the digital illiteracy matter, the matter of cultural inclusion, and so many issues. And what about security? The security issues. Do they help? Do they hamper? Do they influence the access to the internet? Maybe they increase digital inclusion. When we are speaking about encryption or the fear to be connected, I don't want to induce the answers and your discussions, because the idea is to provoke here, to try to ally just 2 big topics that will come in the future. So, will security matters impact on the future of the internet? Yes or no, and why? And what would be this impact? So, this is the big question. There's no right or wrong. We want to listen from you, and we want to understand to where will it take us. So we are going to listen to you. I'll try to circulate around the groups, and so let's have this right, left, and center groups and try to form. This does not have to left wing and right wing parties, but and after the discussion, we are going to be back. And please choose a rapporteur that could summarize your discussion in 2 minutes, and we are able to talk about that. And besides this exercise that is going to contribute to our project, we will go on with this discussion. So if you want to know about one of these drivers and want to learn more about what was done, you may access this information on our website on this link, and you may be part of this report that will be released on in next September. So, any questions? Is it clear? You're so quiet. I think I'm going to break another glass. So, let's come together, let's discuss. Guys, if you want, please come here to the front because it's easier if you want to, of course. I know that it's a great debate, but in 1 or 2 minutes we should finish, okay? Guys, we have to close this debate. Do you have a rapporteur? Are you ready? So please bring the mic. So let's listen to the first group, and we also can go on discussing during the cocktail. Did you like the exercise? Was it good? Okay. What? They have the mic. They were faster. So let's start. And if you didn't reach a consensus, you may report that as well, and report the views of the group. Did you like the exercise? So first group, let's listen to what they have discussed to understand if you think alike or differently. So let's listen to it. We couldn't reach consensus, and I think it's impossible to reach consensus in 15 minutes. So our answer is yes, but not necessarily. Today we're speaking about digital inclusion in this perspective of quantity and not quality. We are not concerned about security, and if we are focusing on security, we are speaking about public policies and training in big cities. And if we are thinking about the rural area and an elderly population, they are not inserted in this debate. So the the more layers we have, more this population can be excluded. And on the other hand, we have this reflection that more and more people are entering the network, and people who are having new uses for this network with disruptive ways of thinking and uses, and this will bring new ways of inclusion that may break these barriers. And one additional reflection, since I only have 2 minutes, is the access prior to infrastructure, the bureaucratic access. We have this colleague who is not Brazilian. He came for SSIG. He bought this internet card, but he couldn't buy it because he needed a Brazilian document number in order to activate that chip. And a friend of ours who had a technical expertise, he was able to go around this problem, but maybe a person who is not aware of that won't be able to have this access. So let's go to this group now. Hi. We have had this broad discussion. We have discussed privacy and even sociology. And to sum up, we found 3 impacts. The first of one is the lack of security, generating vulnerability and insecurity for all the individuals. So we have to think about security on one hand, and on the other hand, it was the excess of security that may generate the surveillance. So some people have had mentioned that today we have a government and we have this e-government system, and tomorrow we have another administration with an authority profile, and maybe will uh, they will have problems or will try to discriminate those who think differently. So this may affect the security of everyone, and I'll even determine infrastructural problems. And the third point was mentioned uh, mainly by him, by my side, and he was speaking about power to the people. We have to work with knowledge so people are able and aware of all these processes that are going on, because if they are empowered, they may try to be more security, and we will improve security. And we also spoke about the lack of literacy in Brazil, because we have many people who aren't able to read in Brazil. So the digital inclusion is necessary, but also the literacy is a necessity. So we have this linear cognition, and when we change our cognition, we have we have other impacts and other conflicts. So 3 different security lines: the excess of security, the excess of security, and power to the people. Okay, Very good, and it complements the other idea of the other group. So last group, who is going to speak? Good afternoon. I'm going to speak in Spanish. When we started discussing this subject, it was the difficult thing was to define security. And what we concluded it was that it was a multi-dimensional subject. We have the infrastructure of the users on one side, and on the user's side, we have this matter that there's this gap, a physical exclusion that has to do with the economical, political, and social plan, and about and we all know that we have a lot of inequalities in this capitalist system, and also we have the access uh, discrimination and also the excess of use that will determine the exclusion in the digital world. And we also have this great responsibility of companies. They are in the role of offering infrastructure like Google does in Africa, and also this responsibility of the governments, because since the company are aiming at profit, they never think about the social part. So the government has a key role in this process, and also we have this. The the foreign affairs on the internet, and they don't know the limits of each country. We have this great technology, and I'm going to give the floor to him. He's going to explain it better. I believe that we have to imagine internet as a digital utopia. So we have to think as the internet as a digital road. In order to have the circulation rules on this road, we have to have the technical uh, surveillance of the cars, and enable everyone to drive with smaller cars and bigger cars, people who have more or less access to the internet. So we have to guide these medium companies, and also Google and Facebooks, who are the big trucks on this road, so they don't run over the small cars. Thank you very much. So let's close this seminar. Otherwise, we won't finish our discussions. And I thank you for all contributions, and we will take your contributions to our report. And if you want to participate, we are open to your participations, and we will receive your ideas. And as I said in this morning, there are no stupid questions. It's more stupid not to ask when you want to ask. And this is also valid for contributions. Thank you very much, everyone.
Well, guys, we're almost at the end. We're going to have a 7-minute video with a message from Edson Manso, with a special message for the school, and then I'm going to invite Sean Flynn for our last lecture. We are having technical problems again. If you can wait for another minute, they are testing a problem in the cable, and if it doesn't work out, Sean is going to give his speech, and then we try again to watch the Edson Lanza video. It's not going to work, at least for now, so I would like to invite Sean Flynn, our last speaker of the week, to do the final session. Então, muito obrigado por me receberem.
Cristiano for inviting me here. Cristiano and I have known each other for about a decade now, and have also known, this institution, this country, this region, this city, and this particular place, FGV and CTS, and the group of internet activists who have been here and forming a new kind of language and trainings for these kind of internet activists have really been part of what's shaping the current moment. And this is a great place to come back to. And I'm extremely excited to see all of you here. I mean, all of you have been here for 5 days working on these issues and working really on charting what the future of the internet's going to be. I want to say a couple words about where I think we are in the current moment, and then progress to a discussion of one kind of component of what the positive agenda in this area can be including. So I think it's useful to kind of think back about what some of the major global struggles that you're part of. You as users, you as internet users, you as intellectual property users, you as activists. And you can trace that struggle back to various kind of moments in the relationship between international law and politics and local policy and flexibility. I study international intellectual property law, so that's kind of the vision that I look at these things through. And international intellectual property law starts as a field in the 1880s. The creation of, on the copyright side, the Berne Convention for the protection of copyrights. Before that, there were no international restraints on what countries could do with copyright. My own country only protected copyrights for specific US citizens. So if you were a British author, you had no copyright protection within the United States. You could locate your copyright within your own sovereign and serve only your particular interests within that. The Berne Convention was the first moment in which international law starts invading the sovereign sphere and starts creating specific norms in international law that had to be enforced locally. But it was fairly flexible even at that point. And it created, to some extent, a backlash. And the agents in that backlash were developing countries in the 1940s to the 1970s who drove what some scholars call the first development agenda. Going back to that idea of sovereign authority and tailoring intellectual property laws to specific country interests. So Brazil at that time had an informatics policy in which it exempted software from copyright to encourage the creation of a local software and hardware industry, for instance. Those kind of moves themselves created a new backlash that was by then being driven instead of by Europe and the Berne and Paris conventions, but by my country, by the United States in the 1980s. Brazil's informatics policy specifically was challenged by the Reagan administration in the 1980s for violating a norm that was not part of any international law. There was no international requirement to protect copyright on software. But nonetheless, the United States started enforcing an idea that that should violate international norms through what's called the Special 301 program. A program that still exists today and allows the United States to unilaterally sanction foreign countries for not protecting what the United States deemed to be adequate and effective intellectual property norms. That series of actions in the 1980s, and there were lots of other countries that were subject to it, led ultimately to what we call a regime shift, a shift out of the traditional intellectual property negotiating forums at the international level, the World Intellectual Property Organization, etc., into the trade field, into the World Trade Organization. And that was a specific reaction to the mobilization of developing countries that had stopped this kind of maximalist articulation of copyright policy within Geneva. And so that same policy was shifted over into the trade field to give an advantage to the demandier countries and led to the creation of the Trade-Related Intellectual Property Rights Agreement in the WTO, enabling the bringing of dispute resolutions into new forums. So it's the one area of international law that we actually have real enforcement of international law norms, unlike, for instance, human rights treaties. And then if you think from there and you start getting into recent history, right, this was all essentially before the internet, but the history of those kind of moments and the reactions to those moments shape where we are today. So the internet struggle begins in the 1990s. And the idea of the rights holders that was being pushed by countries like the United States was that the norm that should govern the internet should be strict liability. That any ISP provider, any platform, should be strictly liable for any content that infringes copyright that transmits over that platform. And if you think for a minute about the world that would have created, it would be a very different world than today. It would be where you'd have specific entry points to the internet, like what we used to call America Online, AOL, right? You'd have a platform in which all the content would be curated on that platform. And there would be no access to the greater internet as we know it today. And that idea was defeated, but it was a close call. And the actors that defeated that norm were primarily ISP providers themselves. It was the old telcos. It was the AT&Ts of the world. It was the people that were providing what was then largely dial-up internet access. And that victory led to a new reorganization of the forces of maximalist restrictions on the internet. And that came through the 2000s. It came through a shift of the agenda into free trade agreements. It came through a shift of the agenda into much more secretive and selective processes that were negotiated bilaterally between two countries and ultimately plurilateral. And that plurilateral moment that comes out in the second decade of the 2000s is where we have ACTA, so the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, solely focused on enforcement of intellectual property rights and largely on the issue of enforcement of copyright in the internet itself. And the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, which carried much of the ACTA terms into a new plurilateral trade agreement that included other trade norms. And in domestic legislation, in my country, the so-called SOPA and HIPAA acts. And all of them were focused on reaching the strength of copyright protectors out deeper into the internet, raising the requirements for damages, raising the length of copyright terms to 70 years past the date of the author, raising the ability to actualize more enforcement and more restrictions on the ability to use the internet. And all of those last moments were all defeated. But unlike in prior moments, the forces that defeated them were not countries. This was the time when internet users actually organized to be part of the politics. So ACTA was not defeated by any of the countries that were part of it. Even the developing countries that were part of that agreement all endorsed it at the end of the day. ACTA was defeated because in the week after it was released in February of 2010, over 300,000 people took to the streets in Europe. And after that, the European Parliament voted down that agreement by a vote of over 400 to something like 30 people for it. The Trans-Pacific Partnership was not ended because of the mobilization of any of the members of that agreement. It was ended because of the mobilization of people around the world who felt themselves affected by different parts of that agreement, including especially the intellectual property chapters, and leading to a new populist wave that unfortunately was captured by the right wing, but is very much a populist wave against that kind of idea that this is the way we should set policy. And SOPA and PIPA as well were defeated by popular mobilizations of internet users, like the people in this room. So we're living in this moment in which internet users, internet activists, have a real voice in what's going on national and international policy. And I guess my takeaway, my push today is that we should be using that power not just to oppose all the bad ideas, and there will be lots of bad ideas, but I think the real focus of this school, of this 5 weeks of training and the nitty-gritty of what the different policies are really needed to sustain this environment, is about creating what we've been calling a positive agenda. What should be the shape of international and domestic law to enable the kind of internet that we want to envision? And part of that is resisting the bad ideas, but part of it is also promoting the good ones. And so I want to talk a little bit today about some of the research we're doing on what internet enabling copyright law should look like. And I want to take an idea I've been situating for the most part, in this introduction, the United States as kind of part of the empire that was striking back, right? It's been using the dark force, not the positive side of it, right? But you can take within that specific country and model ideas that actually are necessary for the promotion of the internet that we want to live in. And so I want to talk about one specific aspect of that, which is openness within the user rights within copyright. And some of the research we're doing showing that aspect is increasingly necessary for the internet that we want, as well as for a host of other interests that copyright should promote. So let me begin by kind of explaining what I mean by that openness, relating it to aspects of US fair use law, and then take you through some lessons to help you recognize it, and then some of the research we're doing to try to figure out its impacts and effects. And I hope what I leave you with is, as you go forward, whether that's in local copyright reform debates, whether that's in international debates taking place in places like the IGF, or the coming debates over an e-commerce negotiation in the World Trade Organization, or the debates currently going on in the World Intellectual Property Organization about what kind of flexibilities should be mandated by the international field, that you'll have a little bit of tools to think about what kind of aspects you might want to push for in those forums, and in particular pushing for that element of openness that I want to turn to now. So, what is fair use? There are debates around the world right now on whether other countries should adopt a US-style fair use right as part of its overall copyright reform. And I want to kind of break down the components of what I see as the helpful elements of fair use and identify in which parts of your copyright we can find them. And by the end, I want to convince you, and I encourage you to engage me over questions and answers, that these elements of fair use belong in every copyright law, whether you're from a civil law country or a common law country, whether you speak Spanish or Portuguese or English or something else, that these components are really necessary for the ecosystem that we're trying to build. And so we should all be trying to identify them and push for them where they go. So this is the US Fair Use Clause. And the three elements that I want to talk about are openness, flexibility, and generality. So by openness, I mean that it's an exception, it's a user right. It's an ability to use copyrighted content. It's what defines, if you will, the social the social obligations, the duties to share on the outside that bound the exclusive rights of the copyright itself. So all property has this feature, right? Whether you're talking about real property, whether you're talking about intellectual property, intangible property, all property is defined by law that defines the sphere in which the owner has absolute control, that's bounded by the public rights, that's bounded by the commons. And the commons is what exists on the outside. And so the first element that I refer to as openness is the idea that you can create this commons, you can create this sphere in which the public has rights in a way that is open to any purpose, that is open to use by any user, and that is open to the use of any kind of work. So 3 dimensions of openness. And so you see that in the way it's phrased, the fair use. So use is itself an open term. It's any kind of use. So it's not, for instance, only restricted to the use of an excerpt, a so-called quotation. It's not restricted to a reproduction, which is just one of the bundle of copyrights. It can include the right to display. It can include the right to transmit, to communicate, to share with the public. It extends, it has no restrictions on the type of users, so it's a fair use by anyone. So it's not restricted, for instance, to only an educational institution, or only a library, or only an archive, or only a certain type of public or private institution. Anyone can take advantage of that right. It applies to any work, a copyrighted work. It doesn't restrict itself, as many copyright laws do around the country, only to literary artistic works. There's an educational exception in Australia, for instance, that only applies to literary and artistic works, and it has the impact of inhibiting teachers from editing cinematographic films, for instance, because that's not a literary or artistic work. So they can't edit movies to re-show in the classroom. So it applies to any kind of work. But then very importantly, it ultimately requires, because by virtue of the word such as, to any purpose. You don't have to be these canonical purposes that you see in all of your copyrights. Criticism and reviews, scholarship, research, etc. And that is probably the most important part
precisa
for
ser
the
esse
functioning of the
propósito
internet.
canônico que você vê em todos os direitos
You gotta
autorais.
ask yourself, and you can go back to your own
Críticas
laws and ask yourself particularly,
revisões
what is there in
escolares,
your
etc.
internet law that
Então, esse
allows
deve
the
ser o
copying of the entire internet,
Propósito canónico de
which
todos
is
los
all
derechos de
subject to your
autor.
local copyright on the moment it is published? It's
Críticas,
all
revisiones
expression that's
escolares,
published
etc.
in a tangible form. In order to enable internet search of the entire internet, in order to enable testing, in order to enable computational research, in order to enable translation programs that I was just using today, speaking with some of you, right? Those translation, the entire internet, in order to enable copying the entire internet by reading the internet and how people use different languages and teach themselves how to translate that into different languages. So in order to do that, you need a right to copy that's not limited for the purposes of research or criticism or review, because it doesn't fit neatly into those categories. Now, the last 2 elements are generality and flexibility. Generality refers to an exception that applies to multiple different kinds of uses. So traditionally, fair dealing rights in the United States are in the UK are general in that way, but usually not open. And the flexibility, as we're using that word, is the test at the end. is in the fair use clause, it's a 4-part test. It could be a 2-part test. I mean, essentially, what that flexibility is always looking at is what are the ultimate core rights of the copyright owner? What is that core, balanced against what are the social purposes for which we're creating an exception? So I don't know that there's anything necessarily magic, for instance, about the way the US has 4-part factors instead of 2. I think the key magic is in that openness to purposes that allows things that the legislature wasn't thinking about at the time to still have an opportunity to justify itself in the digital age. Okay, so whipping through. So Brazil's quotation right, for instance, it has a quotation right. Doesn't have a general clause. It doesn't have a general fair use right. It definitely doesn't have an open, general, flexible clause like fair use. And its quotation right, just to pick one of many, is open in some ways, but it's not open to purposes. So it's open to any means of communication. It's open to any type of work, but it's not open to any purpose. It's only open to the purposes of study, criticism, and polemics. So question whether that allows an internet search engine, for instance, to show thumbnails of pictures as part of your search inquiry. Why are they showing those? Is it for the purpose of criticizing those search inquiries? For the study of them? For polemical purposes? I would say probably no. There's nothing squarely within that clause that allows some of the most common internet activities that we see today. Contrast with Korea's quotation right, which is open. It literally adds the word etc. after the very similar phrases that exist in the Brazilian law. So you can use it for news reporting and criticism and education and research, but you can also use it for etc. You can use it for anything. You can use it for any purpose. And that one worked. So Korean courts actually held that thumbnails in an internet search are an example of etc. that is justifiable because it doesn't really harm the interests of the author. You're actually pointing people to the author's work. You're not distracting from it. You're not competing with them. You're not substituting in the market. This isn't piracy. This isn't Pirate Bay. This isn't downloading songs that replace something from someone who might have purchased those songs. This is creating a new, what we call transformative work, something that does something different, serves an audience in a new way. This is what the internet is all about. Doing things that copyright legislation drafters couldn't think of. In Korea, they actually hit a barrier when they continued to try to use that very open and very flexible quotation law to justify the copying of entire articles in order to submit them to their Food and Drug Agency to approve new drugs. So the pharmaceutical companies were saying, you can't reproduce those because we funded them. And we don't want you to reproduce them to have a generic drug come into your company, come into our market. And so we're going to withhold copyright permission to make that copy of the entire work. And you can't do it through the quotation right. And they won that case because it wasn't an excerpt. It wasn't a quotation. That's the value of having not just openness, but generality. Something that applies to potentially any kind of use, as long as it meets the balancing test. So that's what Korea did. They passed a general open flexible clause. It looks a lot like, not exactly like, the US Fair Use Clause. And the subsequent case that was brought to challenge that same practice was then upheld in Korea and said, well, it's not limited to quotation, and certainly you're not competing with the author of that article by submitting one copy to a regulatory agency. That's a reasonable use that should be allowed. So Brazil actually is moving in this direction as well, but not through legislative change. There's a proposal in Brazil to have an open, flexible, general clause that was moving fairly quickly in the prior presidential administration. I'm also from a country you may know where good things were happening in the prior presidential administration. Not so much now. But so Brazil's courts started doing it anyways, and as have courts in other countries in Europe, in the European Court of Justice. Courts are starting to look at copyright and say, these laws are way too narrow. And whether it's free expression rights, like in Europe, actually looking at the rights to free expression and say that the copyright ultimately trammels on that. And if your legislation is too restrictive, then it's going to have to be justified under a human rights balancing requirement. That gives you that openness and generality and flexibility. You can find it through human rights norms if those work within your system. And Brazil's courts have been finding that same kind of general clause in both looking at free expression guarantees and looking at fairly liberal, expansive interpretations of the work itself. You heard from Alan Rocha a few days ago. I heard he was getting applause. Some of his work is tracing how courts in Brazil are trying to infuse these concepts within Brazilian law. Okay, so the Korea and the Brazilian and the European examples, indicate something that some of these ideas around fair use are actually taking hold, that they're globalizing. And our project thinks that that's a great thing, and that we should be looking at those particular elements and attempting to globalize it. And the first piece of this project is to try to empirically look at whether that's true. Are countries moving in this kind of direction? And we've been putting together surveys and working with experts, some of them are in this room, and asking about digging down into their rules and saying, when you look at your quotation right, when you look at your computer program restrictions, etc., does it allow a copy for any purpose? Does it allow any kind of use? Looking at exactly these elements I've been talking about. And we've also been looking at, which specific exceptions do you have? We've got 20 different exceptions, and we're looking for how many countries have them all versus have only some of them. And we've got about 21 countries. They're about split between developed and developing countries. So from those, there are 8 countries, including the US, so there's these 7 plus the United States, that have fair use per se. Cut and pasted, they've got an open general clause, it has pretty much the same 4-part balancing test, etc. But kind of the point of our research is to say, that's not where we should stop. We should look much further, because if you look at, for instance, that most important element, the element of openness, you actually find that over time, all of the countries are moving up the scale. All of the countries, as they reform their country laws, are taking some of them and making them more open. Why? I think when legislatures look at their Copyright Act and they start making the lists of all the things that should be allowed, at some point they give up and they insert an open clause instead, right? Like, what are the reasons you should be allowed to make a copy of a computer program? Well, there's to make a backup copy. Almost everybody has that. Some have reverse engineer, so that you can reverse engineer something to plug it into different hardware. But then you start going down the list, and eventually you think, why shouldn't you just always be able to make a copy of a computer program, as long as you're not doing it in a way that substitutes for the work of the author, as long as you're not doing it for a reason that isn't fair? So that's what Kenya's Act now says. You can make a copy of a computer program for any reason, as long as it's consistent with fair practice. It liberates, it makes that edge, that boundary I've been talking about, more flexible. Less finite, less contrived, less definite for sure. Little more ambiguous. But that ambiguity creates the space for experimentation. That creates for experimentation that's necessary on the internet, that's also necessary for entrepreneurship. So what if we break this down? So what can we say about the trends? So one trend is very interesting to me that you actually see, although everyone's moving up, Everyone, as they go along, as they reform their copyright laws, tends to reform it in the direction of openness. The richer countries are moving faster than the middle-income countries. You can have a political economy idea about that the companies that are most interested tend to be in the north. But this is where the user is being activated. That kind of first point of my introduction can do something. Because actually the users are activated all over the world. And the small entrepreneurs need to be activated all over the world. We've, in our research, talked to people from different countries and tried to reach out to technological entrepreneurs and asked them about what kind of projects would you do if you had a more open and flexible copyright system. We had an idea the other day of a guy who was working on a project to find postcards out of archives and museums and digitize those postcards, both the picture on the front and the actual writing on the back. So these postcards that apparently archives have all over the world are actual postcards sent between people. And so he wants to create a big internet search database for genealogy researchers so that you could go back and when you're trying to find out where your ancestry came from, you might actually be able to find this particular copyrighted artifact. But he can't do it in Australia where he lives because Australia doesn't have an orphan works provision and it doesn't have a flexible copyright provision. And so his question was, how do I move this project to the United States so I can take advantage of fair use? Because I know this is a fair use of those works, but there's nothing in my own copyright legislation that allows me to do it. And we're really interested in hearing more of those stories, and we'd like to be asking more of those stories of local entrepreneurs. What are your ideas that you're not doing or that you're trying to move because of your copyright environment? So we also find that generally the number of exceptions is rising too, that more and more countries have more and more specific exceptions, but also there you see a gap between the richer countries tend to move faster than the poorer countries. I think these are interesting elements because it's also the richer countries that are pushing for these international restrictions on the limitations and exceptions that poorer countries can have. But at the same time, they're moving their own laws in that same direction that they're trying to restrict others from doing. Okay, so part of why we're doing this research is to enable empirical research to ask the question of whether this stuff is good. So once you have a database that can identify when different countries change their laws to make it more open, you can start linking it to empirical data about, is the software industry growing faster in the countries that have more open copyright environments? Is there more technological investment in the countries that have more open copyright environments? This part of the research is very new, but I'll just share with you a couple insights that we've gleaned so far. So there's an existing body of research that's mostly kind of theoretical, pointing to possible impacts. The one we're focusing on is technological innovation, the idea that in more open environments, you enable more technological transformation and innovation and investment over time. There are other benefits as well. There's studies showing that research and development increases in moments where that social invasion of the core of the copyright law is higher. One of my favorites is this study by Mosser. She looked at what happened in World War II when the United States stopped recognizing German copyrights as part of its war legislation. And the answer was the prices of German copyrighted materials went way down. The supply of German materials went up in libraries, and the uses of those materials went up, and the uses of those materials specifically in patents showing that they led to some kind of innovation was much higher and was statistically significant in comparing that with Switzerland, which continued to recognize German copyrights during the war. So when we shifted to a zero copyright environment for German works, the utility of those works went way up. It's kind of intuitive, but it's nice to have particular empirical evidence. And of course, there's value reasons that we value open copyright norms for freedom of expression purposes and to lead to diffuse social benefits. But we're focusing more on kind of right now on the technological part. So we looked at a group of information firms, so software firms and other firms that deal in information goods. And we did some regression analysis controlling for time and GDP, et cetera. And we're going to continue to do much more detailed analysis here, but I think the point is that we found in this kind of run that the relationship between more openness was statistically significant with more investment. And then the really interesting part was we did not find that same relationship. We found no statistical relationship between the number of exceptions and the profitability and investment in those same industries. So that's a piece of what's promoting our hypothesis, which is that what's important is not necessarily lots of specific exceptions. What's important is how open those exceptions are drafted. So whether you have a quotation exception is less important than whether that quotation exception is open. And that's certainly true, for instance, my thumbnails. Okay, so last point in this talk, which is kind of where do we go from here? So these debates are continuing to go on. They go on in trade agreements, as I mentioned. They're going on in the World Intellectual Property Organization. They're increasingly going to be going on in the IGF. I mean, the Internet Governance Forum has been a positive process shift that this community has been part of, to create kind of the polar opposite of what goes on in trade agreements, to actually create an open forum where issues are discussed in a participatory manner. And one of the things that we can be thinking of in that forum and other forums that we participate in is what should the norms look like on the international level that might at minimum protect and possibly even promote the beneficial aspects of openness within copyright that I've been talking about today. So this is just kind of a quick map of where we are so far. So the Berne Convention, the 1967 version, included what's best seen as a permissive norm. So when you read the way it's phrased, it shall be a matter for legislation. So it's enabling exceptions. It was part of the reproduction right that was added at that time. Over time, we've been losing control of this one. So as it moved into the WTO and was first interpreted by the World Trade Organization dispute panel in the 110.5 case, the WTO adjudicative body, the dispute settlement body, held that this requires you to meet each of those independently. It's now called the three-step test. And the first part of the test is that you have to be in a certain special case. And they say that in order to meet that element, you have to be specifically defined and it has to be narrow. So then a series of more conservative copyright scholars say, and that's why you can't have fair use, because fair use is not certain. And we just admitted that it creates more ambiguity around the periphery of the right. It doesn't tell you you can copy 10% and only 10%. It turns on this flexible balancing test. So one of the objectives going forward is to try to reinterpret this and to reassert sovereignty over that aspect of the legislation, of the international legislation, and try to make clear that we can have open-ended norms within this field. So the US-Korea FTA is the only FTA, the only free trade agreement with the United States that has that kind of actual protective language. After it states the three-step test, it says, well, for greater certainty, each party may adopt or maintain limitations or exceptions to the rights described in paragraph 1 for fair use. Now, it's interesting, if you think about that a little bit. what does it mean? I mean, we know, Americans know that fair use is this kind of open-ended, maybe, we could use the terminology that I use, open, general, flexible exception. But there are legislation actually that use the term fair use. Uganda uses the term fair use in its legislation, and it's not open. It's only available for criticism, review, scholarship, and research. So the terms fair use in themselves are incredibly ambiguous. They don't really win you anything. So the idea of having a protection from the three-step test in the international corpus is valuable. I'm not sure this one actually gets you there. Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement. So this agreement is going nowhere right now. But it did contain a positive balancing provision within it. It's different than the Korea version in that it is not just defensive, it is not just trying to protect fair use, it's actually trying to promote something. The language is, of course, incredibly weak. Although it starts with a shall, what it requires that you shall do is endeavor. So I'm not sure that gets you a whole lot further than a may. So you shall try to achieve an appropriate balance. There are some helpful aspects in that it actually includes such as, so it includes an open norm, but it's only including an open norm in an already permissive frame. So it doesn't say you shall have a norm, you shall have a balancing provision that is open, you shall have a balancing provision that includes such as within it. That would be useful. But at least countries cut and pasting that might end up with a general provision that includes that open norm, but it definitely doesn't require it. And so that's basically where we are on the international field today. So some of the things we're trying to think about as part of this project is, what would that positive framing, what should it look like? What should be the relationship between international and local law today, in a time in which internet users are active, a time in which consciousness of the needs of the internet are much higher than previously, in times in which I think we can say that the maximalist agenda has kind of reached its peak. That the idea that the only goal of the IP provisions of trade agreements and international law should be to constantly ratchet up might be over, and that we might actually be able to insert things within these processes that cater to the needs and interests of our communities. So what should we be asking for within those processes? What should we be asking for in the WIPO negotiations on library and education treaties? Do we just want a specific list? Or do we actually want a mandatory open clause, at least for those kind of institutions? What might we want? I mean, this is a US idea, but if NAFTA is going to be renegotiated, what should its IP chapter look like now? The pharmaceutical industry knows what it wants. The MPAA knows what it wants. Do we know what we want? What about RCEP being negotiated with countries including China, India? What should the copyright balance provisions look like within that agreement? And perhaps the most important question, and maybe the easiest one to answer, is what should your own copyright laws look like? What should an internet-enabling copyright law look like in each of the countries where you live? And that's where I'll end. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. I think this speech is paramount, not only for us to bring back the topic of human rights in the internet governance agenda, but also because of this provocation that Sean did. And we should think about a positive agenda for this topic and also for the other topics that we discussed throughout the week. I think we can open for a few questions if you have some.
Muito obrigado. Eu não sou um advogado.
From what I understood, I am really happy that you think we have peaked and now we are going to go back to more reasonable copyright protections. And I was wondering if, because I'm not a lawyer, if I understood correctly, your next to last slide was a quote from the TPP, and that seemed to me inconsistent with the DMCA. I'm not defending the DMCA at all. I think that's a radical legislation that should be rolled back. But I was wondering if that provision from the TPP isn't actually inconsistent with the DMCA because it opens the possibility, for instance, of people criticizing and things like that, while the DMCA doesn't allow people to even discuss publicly, for instance, copyright, digital rights management mechanisms and their failures, and so please comment on that.
Do you want me to take a couple? Take a couple questions?
Mais alguém? Não?
Eu vou começar com essa, mas
So the U.S. would argue that it's so you're right in that the DMCA is not an open list. The exceptions within the DMCA explicitly for opening up technological protection measures are not open. It's a confined list. And those of us on my side of the battle critique it exactly for that purpose, that the DMCA, like fair use, should be open to whatever purpose as long as it's not substituting for the work of the author. That it doesn't have to be open to enable piracy, but certainly it should be open to enable, for instance, quotation, which it's actually not. So we struggle on that. I think the technical legal definition of this would be, well, this is about copyright, it's not about TPM, so it doesn't, there's no conflict because this is about copyright. But, and I don't have it on a slide, the TPP also, and this was because of the fine work of Chile. I don't know if are there any Chileans in the audience tonight? Chile? No? What? One? Okay, thank you. So through the hard work of Chile and New Zealand, pushed for changing the U.S. Model on free trade agreements for TPMs. So there used to be a model that emulated the DMCA and that it required and in fact restricted countries to only have a closed list of exceptions, and it listed the exceptions, and the exceptions were exactly those within the DMCA. And then it said for any other exception, as the U.S. does, you have to recognize them on a time-limited basis through an administrative process. The TPP now doesn't say that. The TPP has a such as in it. So it now has an open list. And that's a great example. I mean, for those of you who are kind of working on this stuff on the technical level, the takeaway is learn to love such as. Those two words are the opening, and there are other ones that can do it. Including does the same work, It's any modifier that opens a closed list. And so when you have a closed list that says you can have exceptions for the following purposes and no other purposes, that is internet disabling. Because we don't know what we'll be doing with the internet tomorrow. But we do know that it will make copies of copyrighted works. That's the one thing that we know. And so that you constantly need to have this openness, whether it's in TPMs or DRM or your limitations and exceptions, et cetera, that kind of striving towards openness is what saves you at the end of the day, what creates the kind of flexibility around the property right norm that allows you to innovate into the future.
Mais alguma pergunta?
Hello, Camille Zaidan from Brazil. Thank you very much for your talk. It was very enlightening, and I think we're still digesting it. I would try to re-ask a question that has been asked here previously. What do you think about well, in the end, it might go to this, but what do you think about the time that copyright lasts nowadays? Because it seems that with the speed of internet and the content creation that we have today, 70 years after the death of the original author seems too much for our times right now. Maybe in the past it was considered a good time, but even in the beginning, I'm not a lawyer also, but even in the beginning, it seems that it was shorter, and it ended up being added more and more years to this limit. And the technology itself brings us the possibility of decreasing the prices and try to make culture available to more people. If you take a look at the e-books, for example, it was pretty expensive to have a book. In the past, you would need to pay the author first and make an edition and print the copies and pay for the distribution. Nowadays, it's very cheap. So technology itself brings us the possibility of democratizing the access to culture. But we still have this necessity of making the artists and the creators to make a living out of their content. So how do we deal today with this contradiction? How do we deal with the possibility of democratizing the access to culture and make the content creators have their living?
Thank you. Let's take this other one too. Right?
Hi, I'm Anna from Brazil, and I have a question about the fair use clause. What do you think about it? Because it does list some factors. It says that the factors shall include, and then it does list it. But since it does make a list, I would like to know, what do you think about these 4 factors, and do you think you would include something else, or do you think you would take something off the list? That's it.
Good. Yeah, great. And there's one more back here.
La pregunta es el press clipping.
Você pode repetir?
Sim.
Puedes repetir la pregunta?
Sí.
I would like to speak about this clipping. There was an exception in the fair use. The press clipping exception on the fair use session.
I think I got it. If I didn't get the translation, I'll ask again. So good. Let me kind of take these together because I think they're on similar themes. So one can try to imagine various kinds of futures that we're pushing towards, right? And then depending on how radical your future is, you're going to come up against various components of the international regime that are already there. So what do I think about copyright term? 70-year copyright terms don't make sense for any country, including the United States. It's a straight-up political economy power grab that we're exporting 70-year copyright terms all around the world. But 50-year copyright terms probably don't make sense today either. And 50-year copyright terms are in the Berne Convention. And the Berne Convention is in the WTO, which means there's 188 countries that have agreed to international law having at least 50 years. Now, so what, I mean, your points are exactly well taken, and I agree with all of them, that as we move towards the digital age, the length of copyright becomes more and more kind of ridiculous and more inhibiting to things that we should be doing. You know, the empirical studies are that most works that have any economic utility whatsoever make all of their, you know, main resources within the first 5 or 10 years of their copyright term. So if you are building your copyright term just on a rational economic model, copyright terms would be 10, 15 years. It wouldn't be 50, and they certainly wouldn't be 70. And then there's an additional problem which is highlighted by the internet age, which is illustrated by my postcard example. It is much easier today to share orphan works, to share old works, to share works that nobody really cares about anymore, and to find those works and to share them with, you know, we talk about the long tail, right? That now we move in the digital age, we don't just have to serve the small market of stuff that most people like. We can actually have markets on the internet that serve very discrete communities of interest that are dispersed around the whole world. And because we can reach them all at once, they actually become real communities that can actually utilize someone. So how many people, you know, want to do genealogy research with postcards? Like, I don't know, I probably don't know any of those people personally, but in the globe, there are enough to make that a viable business model if you allow it to exist. So how can we allow those things to exist? Well, we can take on term directly, but it's a much bigger fight. You know, it's harder to change the entire international structure. But there are ideas out there, and some of them may be legally permissible. So, for instance, requiring registration after the first 10 or 15 years in order to get the rest of your copyright. So you'd have to have a 50-year term, but could it be impossible to enforce that 50-year term if you failed to meet a formality requirement, if you didn't register, if you didn't express your ownership of that copyright term right after the effective term, after 10 or 15 or whatever years? That, a lot of people would say that probably violates the Berne Convention, but it hasn't been tested. The Berne Convention says you can't have formalities, doesn't specifically say you can't have formalities to meet the whole term. The US Copyright Office has said, well, we should at least have a formality after 50 years. And so to get the full 70, you should at least have a formality, you should have to register. So there's things you can kind of twist there. But the other way to do it is to turn on the flexible side, is to turn on the social side, to turn on the fair use right, and try to define that as expansively as possible, so that when you get to that orphan work that nobody's actually expressing an interest in, and you're using that orphan work for something that has social utility, you win the balancing test. So you're not substituting for anybody's work if nobody can find the author of that work. I mean, who's going to wake up from the grave and sue the guy who makes the postcard tool? No one, right? No one cares about either the painting on the front or the words on the back, and yet most of our laws protect that and say you can't copy it because it was copyrighted at the moment it was drafted. So we have these problems that have always been inherent in copyright law that explode and become so visible in the digital age now that there's actually utility to these things that nobody knew about before. And so how do you tweak the, leading into your question of how do you tweak the four-part test, right? So Yeah, how do we tweak the 4-part test? I don't think there's any magic in the 4-part test. You can put whatever you want in that 4 parts. And as I said, you can make it 2 parts, you can make it 1 part. So let's start thinking about that. So South Africa has a draft fair use right that's been endorsed by its Department of Trade and Industry, and it's being transmitted to their parliament. They're going to have a debate about. And one of their factors is whether someone is using that work to serve an underserved population. Pricing. So one of the problems in copyright and intellectual property generally, as it's globalized, is that it creates an incentive for uniform pricing around the world. So in a model in which you have perfectly enforced intellectual property rights, whether those property rights are on the newest cancer medicine or whether they're on a music CD or some other copyrighted work. If you have no piracy, if it's a perfectly enforced market, then the incentive is to profit maximize by serving the limited number of people who will pay the most for that work. It's price inflexible, the price insensitive part of the market. Unfortunately, most of you in this room are probably in that part of the market, but most of the people in Brazil are not. Most of the people in this country and most of the people in the world will not pay $13 US for a CD. They will not. And if you have a perfectly enforced copyright market, that just means they will not enjoy that good. They will not listen to that music. You will not have the global exchange of culture because people won't be able to afford it. And of course, when you apply that same analysis to medicines, the so-called dead weight loss is actually filled with people that are dying. So you can put into your intellectual property law a means for people to define that social obligation where there is excessive pricing, where there is exclusionary pricing, whether that good is a medicine or whether that good is a book. When you're pricing in Brazil at the same price you're pricing in the United States, and picking up from your point where there's no cost justification, because it's a digital book. You're not even printing it, much less shipping it. So the cost of reproduction of that item is zero. And you're charging, in many cases, more than the hard copy, including in a country in which the GDP per capita is a tenth or a fifth, or if you go to Uganda, less than a one-th of the GDP per capita in the United States. Like, how should we reform our copyright laws and our intellectual property laws to deal with this? And one of the things I would say is put that pricing right into the law. We do it in patent law, right? We have working requirements, and we define working, making the product available in the market on reasonable terms and conditions. And it's up to your government to define what reasonable is. So when South Africa looked at that in terms of some AIDS medications, they said reasonable is a price that people can afford. It's not the price you want to charge everywhere that's the same all over the country. We've had a radical drop of AIDS drugs prices in the last 15 years because the AIDS activists took that idea really seriously. And what are the internet activists going to do? What are the copyright activists going to do with that idea too? Like, what happens when we take that idea really seriously as well? Press clippings. I will admit that the question I got was, what about press clippings under fair use? But so ask it again if I'm not catching the whole part of the argument. But there is actually a huge debate right now between Europe and the rest of the world about whether snippets on the internet are part of what we might broadly conceive of the fair use right. If we term fair use to be just whatever your law says, whether it uses the terms fair use or not, all the limitations and exceptions that apply, right? And every country has a quotation right, because that's the one exception that's actually mandated by the Berne Convention. The Berne Convention says you shall have a right of quotation. It's the only one that you have to have. All the rest of them are permissive. So every country in the world has a quotation right. Many of them, as I showed Brazil's, are restrained in their purposes. They're not open, but they can be open. Most of them include news, reporting on news of the day, but not all of them. All of them in Europe do, but Europe, nevertheless, Spain and Germany and France is considering it, have imposed what's sometimes called a snippet tax. So the idea is when a news aggregator takes a snippet, a 20-word quotation from the actual news article and reposts it on a different website, whether that website be a blog or Google News or whatever it is, that they should have to pay a royalty to the original newspaper that published that article. And so the question is whether that violates the international law. In the US, it certainly violates fair use. There is no snippet tax in the United States. Google News is clearly lawful in the United States and they don't pay anything for it. But that's not clear everywhere. So there still is this struggle, and I think back to your question about have we reached the apex? I think we've reached the apex because I don't think it's possible to go that much higher in the international corpus right now. But it's not to say that people aren't trying. And they're trying mostly at the national level, not the international level. I mean, they will keep trying on the international level, but it's not clear how much further they'll be able to go. But this is one of those areas that they're trying. So the content owners are saying, we want to be paid for quotations, which I find to be crazy under both domestic law, but even under international law, that we have to actually invigorate more quoting. Quoting is like the core of the public right, to be able to steer people to content, to be able to see a little something, whether that's a thumbnail or a snippet, in order to know where you're going, and even to be able to get informational value. So part of their argument is, but people read just the headlines and the snippets, and they don't pay the fee to get our content to the New York Times on the back side. And that gets to the pricing point. Damn right they don't. They can't afford it. And the part of the quotation right is to feed people's knowledge. The fact that they're getting information should not make it your property right. It's the core of the public right, is to be informed.
Yep, no more time. Bom, eu como pesquisadora acho essa discussão.
As a researcher, that was a very interesting discussion, but unfortunately we're going to have to wrap it up. And this was our last answer. We're going to do a last attempt on watching the Edson Lanza video that wasn't shown before. And let's now hope that we are going to be able to see it. Hello, everyone. I would like to greet the South School of Internet Governance, and especially Olga Cavalli, the Getulio Vargas Foundation, for this invitation for this 9th School of Open and Accessible Internet. In this such important work that the school does to promote and disclose the exercise of the fundamental rights through the Internet and through the Internet development. The possibility that everyone in the society is able to enjoy such a wonderful tool for knowledge and for accessing rights and the exercise of fundamental freedom. Today I'm going to speak very briefly about what are the Inter-American standards and on a principle of open internet, and how it can improve accessibility, and what are the obligations of the state in terms of facilitating the access of the population to the internet. The human rights, and particularly the right to freedom of expression, found on the internet a unique instrument to apply the enormous potential of this tool for the population. So that's why we say that the human rights must also be protected in the internet, especially the potential of this tool, which has to do with a multi-dimensional and interactive structure, its design, its speed, and its decentralized model. That is why we are convinced that when you use public policies, they should conserve these characteristics of internet. The principles that will guide it have to do with neutrality, privacy, and the multi-stakeholder model. Regarding the principle of net neutrality, we should always keep the freedom of expression. The Inter-American Convention considers that it's necessary to maintain freedom of expression because this is a transversal principle regarding the other guiding principles, especially because it facilitates the freedom of access and all of the contents, applications, the usefulness of using any kind of platform and filters without having any kind of prevention tool from any author. Part of the countries in the region use the principle of net neutrality, and there should be a surveillance because we talk a lot about blocking and using measures on behalf of national security, so we need to use these benefits in the correct way. I talked about the guiding principles of the internet that guide internet, like the open access, the decentralization, privacy, and neutrality as the transversal principle when regarding the others. In this opportunity, because of time, I'm only going to speak about access as a key element to guarantee that the population and all of the sectors of the population are benefited from the internet. The access to internet is made up of a sine qua non condition for the effective exercise of the human rights, especially the right of freedom of expression and also right of association, reunion, health and culture. It increases the vulnerability and perpetuates the inequalities. Of course, the states must guarantee the connectivity and the universal access, and also quality for the technologies of information, infrastructure, and also, as much as possible, expand the system all over the territory. Need to develop public policies thinking about the infrastructure and the committees that were made by every region of the population. In America, 55%, and in Latin America, 55% of the people don't have access to the internet, and that is a problem. I also like to talk about the principles that constitute this universal access. It's not only facilitating the access to the technologies of information and the connectivity necessary to access the internet. It also has to do with the digital literacy. Access to internet is not only satisfied with connecting to the internet. We need people to be able to interpret the information and have the necessary minimum knowledge to enjoy this technology, and also use this technology in the most effective way possible. It's important to have linguistic plurality to be able to achieve access to the internet without discrimination. And this is also connected to something that is very important. It has to do with the creation of local content. How we can contemplate the language of the native people and African descents. And also, to finish, I would like to speak very briefly about the role of the private sector and this possibility of taking the access and connectivity to all of the Latin American territory to facilitate all people and groups of people to use the internet. Of course, I believe that it's important to have a multi-stakeholder model, and the private sector is very important for the development of the internet in this sense. We have many initiatives to facilitate the access to the internet, and among them we have the zero rating plan that generated somehow a kind of controversy due to the facilitating the access on one hand, but restricting some special applications on the other hand. Of course, we're going to approach this topic on the next report that we will see 15 to 20 days from now, approved by the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, and we're going to speak about some of these topics because we believe that all of the sectors must have wide access to the internet. These plans have to do with some kind of promotion of the company's products are not incompatible with the universal access to the internet, but they cannot substitute the obligations of the states when it comes to accessing the internet and facilitating this right. This also has to do with access, so I would like to mention them just to finish this intervention. Thank you very much for these few minutes and for all your attention. It's too bad that I had to do this by video. I cannot be there today. I really like to participate and be part of these events in person, and I like to take part in these debates that the school promotes, but I hope that next year I can be there with you and keep in touch so that I can be in the next editions of this event. Thank you very much. Just a few announcements. First, don't forget to return your headphones and the translation devices. In second place, we have a cocktail to you after you return your headphones. And in third place, a round of applause to Oscar, Adam, and Olga, the soul of the school. And finally, a round of applause to you. You were an amazing audience and an amazing class. Thank you very much. Now the cocktail. Last warning, the certificate. We had a small problem with the participants list, so the certificates are going to be submitted next week to everyone. If you don't have your name on the list, please send an email to Adrian, and you're going to receive the certificate next week. Last warning, I promise. So Olga knows that everyone is with her, even though she is not here. Please scream, "I love you, Olga," or "I hug Olga."